Thanks everyone for joining us today. I am Amy King. I'm the founder and CEO of Pallet, and I'm really excited and grateful to be joined by Mayor Cassie Franklin and Dr. Lena Miller, and we'll introduce them and have some conversation with them later. But to start, I wanted to kind of run you through a number of reasons why people experiencing homelessness don't accept shelter and some potential solutions for how we can resolve those things. So a couple of things to know about me, a little bit of background. About 7 years ago, my husband and I started a company called Square Peg Construction, a general contracting company that builds permanent product, both market rate and affordable. And in starting that company, we met a number of individuals who had personally experienced homelessness, addiction, and or had interaction with the justice system in the state of Washington. And as we sat down and started talking with them and learning from them, we really realized that there was a big gap in the system, and we really wanted to help address that gap. And so as a result, we launched Pallet, which is a panelized shelter company I'll talk a little bit more about later. At the same time, we also launched a service company called Weld Seattle that prioritizes people with lived experience to build programs and services for folks that are impacted by those same systems, the justice system, addiction recovery, and homelessness. So we have a lot of experience in this space and wanted to apply that to the marketplace to help create a more broad and holistic service offering for folks that are experiencing homelessness. So why do people who are experiencing homelessness reject shelter? I'm sure this is happening in your cities or you've heard about it on the news. A lot of folks, obviously, as you've probably seen, are living in congregate shelters, rotating in and out of those, living in tents and RVs, couch surfing, things like that. That's what we typically see. And there's a number of reasons why those folks traditionally will reject specifically congregate shelter options. Many folks experiencing homelessness have pets. They have partners that they want to stay with, and a lot of congregate shelters are single gender, so male or female. And if folks don't want to leave their partner, which I wouldn't either, then they don't want to go to those shelter locations. Also, there's issues with security, feeling like their things aren't safe in those congregate settings, limited hours of operation for folks that are working. Many people experiencing homelessness have jobs, and so their ability to get in and out of the shelter in a timely manner to get to and from their jobs can be problematic. And there's nowhere for them to store their things if they want to work or get services. And often those street services are not available. Sometimes they are, and it's hard for the service providers to find folks. So often those scenarios that we're talking about do not include the wraparound holistic services that people need and often want to have access to, and it's hard for them to get. So what do we need? How do we solve this? So what we typically see in our experience at Pallet in addressing homelessness with cities across the country is sort of a pathway that many people take. And a lot of people jump in and out of this pathway in various ways, but many people go from congregate shelter to transitional housing to then permanent supportive or affordable housing. That's the goal, right? Ideally, we would have a lot more available supply of all of these things because we recognize that people experiencing homelessness don't all have the same needs. They have very complex needs. And so often they need, some people want the congregate setting and thrive there. Some people need more individual space. Some people can go straight to permanent supportive housing. But we're going to talk about each of these things because we need all of them in order to solve this crisis. So to start, let's talk about congregate housing. So obviously this is really quick and easy to set up. It can be very cost effective. You can use vacant buildings or available properties to get these up and running quickly and get people inside. This is a great scenario when you're doing cold weather sheltering or trying to come up with a really rapid option. But again, there are a lot of people who are traditionally service averse who don't want this environment because they might have PTSD, they might be concerned about medical vulnerabilities and exposure to illness, and a variety of other things that we already talked about. So this is a needed solution, but it should not be the only solution. Another great solution, which we, of course, at Pallet are really supportive of, is the transitional shelter model. And what we've seen here is this is a really rapid and cost-effective opportunity that cities can use to scale their shelter supply quickly while utilizing vacant properties. So this allows for really great reuse of land, optimizing your land utilization in spaces that might otherwise be unusable. They might be undevelopable, or they're awaiting permits, those properties, and you can use that space in the interim while you're waiting for those permits to come up for permanent housing. And then you're getting that land utilization in the interim while you're waiting. So this is a great opportunity also for public-private partnership, partnering with corporations or with businesses in your community, using their parking lots, using all kinds of things. So there's a lot more creativity allowed here in this model. Another really important model, obviously, that we need more of is the permanent supportive housing. Permanent supportive housing requires a great deal of infrastructure in order to be successful. So you got to have the mental health workers and the support. Often there's medical care involved. And so this is often very expensive and time intensive because you're building a permanent building and you need a lot more resources and support to make this sustainable. This obviously is very needed for the folks in this population who cannot live alone and need permanent support and constant service interaction. So we do need to build more of this as well. This is our belief at Pallet. But as you wait for that to be built, we want you to be able to get people inside and stabilized while they're waiting for these opportunities to become available. And then finally, the thing we all agree on that we need more of is affordable housing. So this looks like a lot of things, and I have a lot of, Pallet has a lot of feelings and opinions about affordable housing, but the idea here is we need housing across the spectrum at all levels for all people, and it needs to be achievable for everyone and sustainable. So that looks like job training and workforce development. It looks like access to documentation so that people can get services, social services and support so that they can obtain this housing and then continue to maintain it and be able to access it long term. So we want to be focusing on that, on affordable housing supply, but recognize that building affordable housing, building housing of any kind right now, takes a really long time and is really costly, especially with inflation right now and the cost of construction materials, things like that. So in the interim, we want to have really good solutions. So why are cities turning to non-congregate shelter models? We're seeing this more and more often. At Pallet, we have over 80 active sites across the country today, operational and sheltering people, leveraging amazing service providers like Dr. Miller's team at Urban Alchemy. So for a number of reasons we've talked about today, we see more and more cities turning to this model because they need creative solutions. And unfortunately, the crisis is growing and growing really rapidly. So as COVID has spread and there's been a number of issues and concerns around people being exposed and things like that, we definitely want to create space where people have their own individual space, but they can be rehabilitated in a supportive community setting. So Pallet shelter villages are rapidly deployable. They provide dignified space and that healing community environment. And we have a number of shelter solutions that you can see there. So the model itself often looks like transitional housing filling the gap between a tent encampment and more permanent stable housing. What we've seen at our sites across the country is folks are often not ready to go straight from the streets to permanent housing. Sometimes they are, but it helps to have this practice of being housed and to come in and stabilize and have consistent engagement with a service provider that's reliable, that they can build trust and community with, and start to get used to reintegrating back into society, preparing themselves to sustain that permanent housing once they get there. A lot of folks don't realize that a lot of people get placed into permanent housing and then they end up going back to the streets because that's where their community is and they feel isolated and alone in their permanent housing. So again, this fills that gap and creates that opportunity for folks to get community and supportive services that they need so that when they go to permanent housing, they will stay there because that's the goal. We don't want them to go back out onto the streets. So at Pallet, we recently built a community in Boston, and we wanted to highlight this for you. People living in a local tent encampment were interviewed by city officials, and previously many of them had rejected services, but after they set up the Pallet community, they went to this tent encampment and asked the folks there, and 95% of those folks who had traditionally been service averse said they would leave their tents for transitional housing and specifically for their Pallet shelter community. Why? Because they knew they'd have their own space, but in a community setting where they could stay together and still have the support that they had built on the streets, which is a really important part of this community building. So we wanted to share that with you. We also wanted to share with you, if you go to our website at palletshelter.com, there are a number of really awesome case studies of the various cities where we have set up communities and villages, and you can see all kinds of information about how we did that, who the partners were, how the city officials were engaged, all of that good stuff. So Los Angeles is a great example. There are over 66,000 people sleeping unsheltered in Los Angeles County. And since then, in the last year, since 2020, the city of Los Angeles has built 9 pallet shelter villages. I think we might actually be at 10 now, but we're growing all the time. The number's changing all the time. And so for the thousands of people who live on the street, that housing couldn't come fast enough. But at least we were able to set these up really quickly. So thousands of shelter beds created in a matter of a year for very little cost and very quickly. So you can check out more about those on our website. And then finally, we have some photos here just to give you an example of what our villages look like, some folks who've lived in our villages. And it's a place, again, for people to connect to services, to have their pets, to stay with their partners, to have security and access to the services, which is really the critical piece of the success of our sites. Pallet shelters are a tool that allow people to come inside and encourage them to come in and get services and move on to the next thing. But the magic sauce that makes these communities work are the service providers that engage with those folks, prepare them, get them housing ready and moved on. And then certainly the city officials who really are the ones who make all this happen and put all the pieces in place to allow us to do this work. And so with that, I want to introduce our panel members and we'll answer some questions for you. So today I'm really excited to have with me Mayor Cassie Franklin, the mayor of Everett, which is where Pallet is very proud to operate from and where our manufacturing headquarters are. She comes from a service background and has been a champion for people experiencing homelessness, helping them enter a more sustainable future and building resources and services and support for people in her community. And then I also want to introduce Dr. Lena Miller, who is one of my heroes, the founder of Urban Alchemy, who is a absolutely stellar service organization that prioritizes folks with lived experience, building them and their opportunities to become mental health and social service workers in the community, which is something we very much need in order to overcome this crisis. So really excited to have you both with me. And with that, I'll hand it over to Brandon to launch the questions for us all.
Yeah, thanks, Amy, and thanks again to our great panelists. I'm going to kick us off as I start the moderation of the Q&A with this question we have on the screen. But for everybody that's on the webinar, our Q&A is open. So if you want to drop some questions in, I'll get to those. We'll work through all of those throughout the rest of our time here. So I see a few questions already coming in, but feel free to drop them in and I'll get to them as we move on. But let's start with this question. How has the affordable housing crisis affected your area in the past 3 years? Mayor Franklin, let's start with you and talk a little bit about Everett and the greater Northwest and how affordable housing crisis has affected your area.
Sure, happy to speak to that. First, thanks for having me. Honored to be here with Amy and Dr. Miller and talk about this important issue. I'll talk about the affordable housing crisis, but I also want to talk about it separately from the homelessness crisis, because they are absolutely interrelated, but they're very different populations we're working with. And so I think sometimes our communities say affordable housing and they're thinking homeless shelters, and they're very, very different. So first of all, Everett has had a housing crisis. The West Coast has had a housing crisis for decades now, and the pandemic has only exacerbated that. So the last 3 years, it has just gone out of control. Everett is about 20 miles north of Seattle. So Seattle was always that unaffordable, big city, and people would move to a more affordable working class community like Everett. Now Everett is also becoming unaffordable. I just actually had a conversation with one of our residents that her rent was going up $300 a month, and she's on a fixed income. So, that is not going to be affordable, and that's going to lead folks like that individual into homelessness if we don't protect the affordability that we have in our communities, because affordable housing is for everybody. It is for our nurses, it is for our firefighters, our police officers, our baristas, our working families need affordable housing. Everett needs housing at all price points. But then on top of the affordable housing crisis, I want to be very clear that we have a homelessness crisis that existed long before the pandemic. The pandemic kind of reduced resources, changed the dynamic of what was going on in our communities. People were no longer working in the city, they were working remotely. And then the cities kind of fill up with the folks that are living unsheltered. and more people in this environment of the pandemic became unsheltered, or the issues that led them to become unsheltered, whether it was behavioral health issues, mental illness, addiction, only got worse in that time where services were reduced. So the homelessness crisis has escalated tenfold, I guess, in the same period. So I just want to say that they're both interrelated, very important issues that we're working towards. And I see Pallet as a very important tool in addressing homelessness and, making sure that we have pathways to affordability for folks. Thanks.
Great. Yeah, thanks for that. I'm sure that's something that a lot of the audience, especially the fellow mayors on the call here, can relate to, that this is something that a lot of cities right now are facing, especially in those cities that are surrounding a major metropolitan like Everett, that are near Seattle and others. Dr. Miller, I'd love to hear from you on this topic as well. I know your team does a lot of great work across California and now other regions as well. Could you share from your perspective what you're seeing in some of these larger cities that you're working directly in?
I think it's complicated. I think affordability is definitely an issue. I don't really see a bright light at the end of that tunnel. I think, affordability has gotten worse across the nation. And I don't really see a lot of creativity or kind of will to deal with it across cities. And then that's exacerbated, particularly in places like San Francisco and now LA, where you have a flood of fentanyl, and all the whole drug supply has been tainted with fentanyl purposely, right? That first they started kind of putting it in the opioid supply and then meth. And so you have all these people who now have these extremely serious addictions. And it's hard. I think that's the other issue is that it's hard to place people in housing who have really, really serious addiction issues. A lot of people who own the housing just, don't want them in there because there's a lot that goes wrong, right? The water overflows or something else. So like in the case of LA, you have all these housing vouchers and nobody can get housing. And so I think, we have to figure something out as a society, because the one thing that nobody talks about when they talk about people sleeping rough on the street is the tremendous amount of harm that's done to people and trauma. I think, women who have been sexually assaulted is like 100%. I think it's pretty high among men too, although a lot of men don't talk about it. But I see hope at the end of the tunnel when it comes to temporary shelter. The reason why is I think we had a little different experience in San Francisco. Maybe I'm missing, as a service provider and not an elected official, some of the variables, but our homeless count actually showed a 15% drop, right? Where every other city skyrocketed around us. And what I saw is a lot of money coming in from the feds that wasn't there, and a rapid deployment. I know we were the first people on the ground. A lot of the other all the service providers at the beginning of the pandemic said, no, thank you, and we started the first 3 SIP hotels, the safe sleep villages, all that kind of stuff. And then what I also see is a lot of creativity, around different kind of shelters, like pallet shelters, tiny home villages, all that kind of stuff, where you're really able to get people off the streets and into a temporary and private shelter setting. So I'm not quite sure if that answers the question. Like I started out saying, it's complicated.
Yeah, no, that was great. And I think if any of us had all the answers, we wouldn't have the crisis that we have as a nation right now. But that was great. Thanks for sharing that. One question that I'm looking at here that I think kind of extends on what you were just saying, Dr. Miller, is somebody in the audience is asking if we can discuss funding sources that cities you work in have seen around this work, whether it be Pallet shelter villages or comparable models? I know on the Pallet side, we've had a few cities use some of the CARES Act funding, state funding, private funds. So there's a variety, but I'm wondering if we could start with Mayor Franklin again, if you could speak to funding
Sure.
that your city has accessed for these projects.
Yeah, happy to. So when before actually all that, the federal funding that's available right now, we were interested in Pallet and interested in making it happen. So we started to work with the team to identify how we could do it using city-owned property. So that helps with the expense right there. If you take city-owned property that's underutilized, that's just you're holding it for a future purpose. So we looked at those properties, and that allowed us the land. We were also able to get a state grant from the Department of Commerce, our county human services, and of course now use American Rescue Plan dollars. Pallet is so affordable. I think that when you, as a city, and you're trying to figure out your way out of this housing crisis or how to build a new shelter, you're talking millions of dollars, and it's overwhelming. Pallet shelters are like $7,000 a pop. Amy will correct me if I'm wrong, but it is so much more affordable that it's kind of mind blowing how much easier it is to get temporary shelter up. And my background was as a service provider, as you said, and there are so many people that congregate shelter is not the appropriate solution. And the folks that we were seeing in our city that we're like, okay, we've got these great service providers, we've got these hotel vouchers, we've got these dollars and these programs, but none of our unsheltered population wanted to access those services. There were just too many barriers. And I needed a solution for the folks that were living in encampments, for the folks that really were service averse, who were 90% of the calls of angry residents saying, Mayor, why aren't you doing something about this? And maybe a smaller portion of the population, but it's really causing kind of the pain points as the city. And so the dollars, you can kind of pull them together out of all of these other sources. But again, Pallet is so much less expensive than these other models. We needed far less funding than we would have to buy a motel or build a shelter or acquire even a warehouse to house people. So there are those a lot of different dollars available right now.
Yeah, Brandon, if I could add quickly from our perspective on the funding side, as Mayor Franklin noted, there's a lot of funding streams available, and we've experienced a number of cities and states having some confusion around whether or not HUD dollars, FEMA dollars, wherever the federal money is originating from, there's sometimes confusion around whether or not that can be used for interim shelter solutions, whether it be a Pallet community or a safe sleep site, like the sites that Urban Alchemy runs in San Francisco. There's a variety of interim shelter solutions that are far more cost effective than building permanent buildings that will become congregate shelters. And they can be, again, used temporarily while that permanent housing is pursued, which should be the goal, right? Those federal funding streams, we can help clarify if you can use them for Pallet villages and or other safe sleeping sites, things like that. So we have folks on our team who will assist and advise you and help you figure out how to leverage those funding streams effectively for a variety of models, not just for Pallet villages, but we also have direct connections with folks in HUD and in FEMA, and we can help clarify for city officials what funding streams can and should be used for these types of models.
And I just want to jump back in there too. The city continues to work on permanent supportive housing. That is our goal. We've built permanent supportive housing here. It takes years. We're very proud of it. We need so much more of it. We are continuing down that path, working with outstanding housing developers, our nonprofit partners that understand the population that needs services. But I can't wait 4 years for a new housing project to be built and for us to get all the complex funding for that. I needed something more quickly, and that's where Pallet came in to provide that bridge.
Yeah, that's a great point. And in that 4 years, your city may change even still, and the people that are currently living on the street shouldn't suffer for that change. So that's a really great point. Our next question I've got from the audience, this one I think any of the panelists could answer, so I'll let whoever wants to take this one jump in. But somebody in the chat is asking, beyond placement into permanent housing, which of course is a goal of these villages, what are the other measurable or quantifiable results that you consider successes beyond, of course, there's the diamond goal of moving to permanent housing. What else is happening in these villages that's quantifiable and measurable that you see as a success?
I'll speak as an elected leader, and I'll say one of the successes is, and so our first pallet shelter village, and I have a hard time calling them villages because I really do not like teeny home villages. These are not teeny home villages. So anyone who's listening, this is not a teeny home. This is a shelter. It is a very different model, and Amy can speak really eloquently to that, so I won't. But we had this area that was just a disaster. It was a huge encampment. We got so many complaints. It was not safe for the individuals out there. So we had angry residents complaining that we weren't taking care of the city. But I was also just really worried about the people that were living in those unhealthy conditions. There's health hazards. Dr. Miller spoke of the sexual assaults and things that people experience on the street. This is not an okay environment for people to sleep in. So we created a pallet shelter community, and we coupled it with a no sit, no lie around that pallet shelter community. That sounds crazy, but it actually works really well. It's like a win-win. The community is safer. The whole pallet shelter community, that we were able to get people inside, living safely in their with dignified four walls, and the businesses that were impacted. Again, this also helped us locate it. So all the NIMBYism, like, oh, this is going to make our neighborhood worse. Actually, it made the neighborhood better. It has improved the neighborhood. We took care of the health crisis. We have a safer neighborhood there now. And the people in the pallet shelter community are, after months, it takes time because these are service averse populations that have a lot of trauma from years of abuse on the streets and drugs and whatever illnesses they've been dealing with, but they are getting treatment. They are connected to social workers. They are getting medical treatment. And some of them have been able to transition out of pallet into permanent. So to me, that's a huge win.
So our numbers are pretty good, even for the safe sleep, which is people are still in tents. So the doctor you referred, Dr. Miller, so people know that I'm a psychologist, so I have a doctorate in psychology. And so not only do we do these kind of shelters, but we're all over the streets. We do street cleaning, we do alternatives or community-based safety that focused on people experiencing homelessness, and so many services. So we're touched down on people on the street everywhere, and I read all these reports, and I think people don't quite understand how horrible a lot of the conditions are in these encampments, right? We're talking rats the size of chihuahuas that are in and out of people's camps. They're filthy. A lot of times, which attracts more rodents. Some people are cohabitating with the rodents. You have children out there in some cities. Like, this is real. And in most of the encampments, there's a mayor there that's collecting rent. That's another thing most people aren't aware of. That's why we have a lot of tents that get on fire. You don't pay your rent, your tent gets set on fire. So I think people don't quite understand the level of trauma that we are allowing people to humanity to descend into. And so what we see is that when you put people in a safe space, right, they have access to toilets, they can be assured that people aren't going to be running and taking their stuff. They don't have to pay rent. They can, all these kinds of things that people begin to stabilize. They're not constantly in that highly alert, where their amygdala is working overtime and they're just in the survival state. And that when people kind of are able to come down from that, then they're able to, the frontal cortex, your planning, all that kind of stuff. And when you get stable, that's when you can get your documents. That's when you can kind of have the space to figure out your life. So yeah, we've seen outstanding results. I also want to say, also kind of link that to the last question. I think we also need to have within our national conversation, we need to have very real conversations about the price of these places, right? Because I know it's been a criticism of Pallet, it's been a criticism of Say Sleep. Oh, they're $70,000 per tent. That's ridiculous, all these other things. But the tents are $150. Let's be honest. You're not paying for that. Even the toilets and the showers and the laundry, that's not that expensive. What you're really paying for is staffing, right? So it's clean, so it's safe, and and so the area around it for the community, so the community isn't impacted and don't turn into NIMBYs and they become YIMBYs after that, right? You start seeing a different side of them once their communities are made safer. So I think my main answer to your question is that I don't think the public in general is really, really aware of the psychic deterioration that is happening to people on the streets. And I think it's humanity, as people who care for our people, we just can't allow that to happen. So, yeah.
I agree, Dr. Miller. I think that's great. And I would add, to answer the question as well, that, since we have a number of sites across the country, we are just now starting to collect some data from those sites and understand the outcomes and the benefits. And certainly permanent housing placement is the goal, and that's what we want to see people achieve. But there are a variety of steps that occur between entry to a Pallet Village or any interim shelter solution, a safe sleep site as well, and then permanent housing. And that looks like things like full documentation so that you can rent an apartment or get a job or, go get the services that you need because you have your social security card again, that kind of thing. And then, there's a lot of folks, we're seeing a ton of folks engage with services and going to treatment. And normally they wouldn't, because they're sleeping outside and they're consistently using substances to numb that trauma. But if they come inside and they feel safe, then over a period of time, that window opens of interest in recovery, and then they ask, and they're in a safe space where someone can help them get into treatment if that's what they want. And then, all kinds of things like that. The other thing I want to say is that there's a common misperception about permanent housing placement. So a lot of folks in America believe that we need a permanent supportive housing unit for every single person that's experiencing homelessness on the streets. And that's just wrong. It's absolutely false. And what we have seen in our sites across the country is that the vast majority of people who live in Pallet Villages and in interim shelter solutions belong to someone. They're a son, a daughter, a mother, a father, an aunt, an uncle, a grandparent, but they have made choices or things have happened to them that have caused them to be separated from that family of origin, sometimes for good reason. So, that's a separate situation. But oftentimes those folks, once they get stabilized and engaged with services, they can be rehabilitated to the point that they can be reunified with their family, which is a community that can be helpful and supportive to them in the long term if they're safe to go there from their perspective and the family's perspective. And so I think that's another key point of success to me that we don't talk about, that we don't track, is we say, well, we placed you in permanent housing. That's great. What if we get you reunified with your family or your, the place you came from, whatever that looks like? That's also a success in my book, and something that we're seeing a lot more of because people are able to rehabilitate so they can reintegrate successfully.
Yeah, great point. Great point, Amy. Amy, at the start of the webinar, you talked about the challenges that some folks living on the streets have with accessing congregate shelters, because, for example, a mother with a child or a mother with pets might not be welcome if there are restrictions around access. And Dr. Miller, you've talked about the trauma of living on the streets. I think these are all good segues into a question I'm seeing here around what are some of the unique challenges that women face living in homelessness on the streets?
Yeah, I can start with this one. I mean, I think there's so many, but you mentioned a couple. So one is, often congregate shelter solutions are gender specific. So if you're a woman who's in a partnership with a heterosexual partnership, then you cannot stay with your partner and go to a congregate shelter. which as a married woman, that would be problematic for me because my husband is my protector and I would want to stay with him, right? But what we typically see is women who are not in those kinds of relationships and they feel unsafe and insecure. And there's a lot of barriers, perceived barriers that can be real in those congregate scenarios. So fear of who's sleeping next to me, are they safe? Am I going to have to worry about sexual assault and the things that Dr. Miller mentioned? Also, sometimes there's not always, but oftentimes as people move into supportive housing, there's financial implications. And if you're a single mom, you can't get childcare. That's really hard to get. There's issues with workforce opportunities, things like that. So those are some of the things that I have seen specifically. I think there's a lot more services popping up that are gender specific for women, which is great. And I would actually say there's a lot of struggle for women, and I don't want to minimize or set that aside, but the number one, like the primary population of people experiencing homelessness is men. And like we used to have this joke in King County, we wanted to start a campaign called Love a Homeless Man because they actually get really rejected in a lot of scenarios for sometimes good reason, but we need gender specific opportunities for both genders, and then for people that are binary or non-identifying, we need to figure out how to give them a safe solution. There's a huge population of people experiencing homelessness from the LGBTQ community. There's not good resources and supports and services for them to navigate their mental health challenges and concerns and the things that they're facing. So yes, we need to prioritize and help women because they often are more vulnerable, but there's such a mix of people out there that need our help and support. So I just want to say that. So I'll stop there, let the others answer.
I think you hit most of the points, Amy. It's, I think like anywhere else, women have it pretty tough, and especially when you're talking about the most vulnerable people, where you have a lot of times people are working in their survival, it gets even tougher. That's just a real thing. It's just really bad, which is why, again, I think that we can't allow these things to go on in our streets. It's unconscionable. And there's a way to do it, right? I think that the field has gotten so much better over time as we become aware and conscious of what goes on and what people's needs are. And we get better and better and better at it. Now, one of our models or our model period is that we don't have curfews, right? Pets, partners at all the areas that we run. We have a few with for people, vehicles, RVs, cars, whatever. The Pallet homes and tents, and at all of those places, we don't have a curfew. Pets, partners, property, we figure it out. There's a few basics in there. So anyway, we were talking about women, weren't we? And I went down a rabbit hole. I'm sorry.
It's all good.
I'll just add to that. I mean, I used to, the organization I used to run was helping homeless and at-risk youth, anyone in the age of 20, under the age of 21 and as young as 13. And so we certainly saw the traumas that those kids experienced on the streets, especially young women, but also our young men. And if they'd been on the street for an exceptionally long time, that trauma is so much higher, and their ability to be housed in a congregate shelter environment was lower because of the fear of assault, the fear of what, even if it wasn't going to happen, even if we had a really safe congregate shelter, that fear was such a barrier to accessing services, which is why I think this non-congregate single shelter environment, where it can be this one person or this one person and their partner, it creates this safe space. And for folks that have been living outside, there's a barrier to getting into an apartment building. In a hotel, you have to go into an entryway, there's multiple floors. It's so foreign if you've been living outside. And I want our house people to understand that it takes people time to adjust to housing, and Pallet is this kind of the single use occupancy shelter. Really is, it takes away almost all those barriers. So it's a perfect solution for folks that have experienced a lot of trauma, and there is a lot of fear of accessing services for re-traumatization. I think that is what makes it such an attractive solution for some of our most difficult to help neighbors and residents. Is I know we all want to help them, but it can be really hard, and this is a really interesting solution that we've had just more success than we have with other ones.
Yeah, in speaking with our site manager for our village in Tacoma, Washington, they often refer to pallet villages or communities as a practice run at being housed. And as somebody that is a member of the housed community, that was eye-opening for me to understand all of those challenges. And not everybody needs that practice run, as Amy mentioned earlier, but for those that do, it is that on-ramp.
Absolutely.
In the city of Everett, Mayor Franklin, we got a question about how did you go about choosing the location you selected? We know that land can be difficult to find in cities across
It's
America.
the hardest thing, right? No one wants to see people living outside. They get angry, but no one wants a shelter or any solution in their community, even affordable housing, which is just like a housing, honestly. People get worried about that. So the way we did it was I asked the team for a map of all of our public properties. I want every single public property. I want us to evaluate everything that we own, if any of those would be viable. I also asked to look at anything else, if it was a site that they thought would be suitable, probably not smack dab in the middle of a single family neighborhood, right? You're gonna get the most NIMBYism, most pushback in that community. And so after the team, Public Works, Planning, our community development team, and certainly working with Pallet, analyzed all of those different sites, how many people we would want to house and how we could get the services to the individuals. We identified one that was right behind our mission. And again, that was hard because this was an area that was already being impacted by the services. We have the only shelter in the entire county right here in Everett. And so they were like, are you kidding me? You're going to put more shelter in our neighborhood? The businesses and the residents in that neighborhood were scared. So that's why we looked at, okay, well, what can we do to improve the neighborhood? How can we make sure that this is actually going to be a positive impact, not a negative impact? And the No Sit, No Lie was very helpful. But I'll tell you, we have 2 other pallet shelter communities coming up. One is going to be, and that one mainly houses single adults, mainly single men. The next shelter is for women and children, and that is very close to single family. It is church. It is in a neighborhood. And so that is where that project will be going. And then a third site that we'll be discussing that is on unused property that the city owns, that is kind of somewhat close to residential, but more close to former industrial. So it's kind of like finding those transition properties in your city that kind of where you're almost making everybody mad, your businesses and your residents, but it's not in the middle of anybody's area. And so those borderline properties, and again, city owned. So if it was utility owned or transit owned or the general fund owned, that's what we did to identify those properties.
Great, thanks for sharing. Amy, do you have thoughts on this too? I know we've worked in, as you mentioned, over 80 communities nationwide. How are village sites selected in cities, and what are some creative ways you've seen sites selected?
Yeah, so we've seen a ton of creative solutions. And as I always jokingly say, as a real estate developer in recovery, I understand the challenge of land selection. And so that's been actually really helpful for us, for Pallet, in coming alongside some of our cities that have invited us to the table. Something we're happy to do and help people understand how to maximize their land utilization opportunities. I think most cities would be really surprised. I mean, Mayor Franklin is an exception to the rule. She went to her staff and said, show me what's available. Mayors and elected officials are not developers. That's okay. They're not supposed to be. So leveraging that skill set and experience in someone else, whether it be a local developer partner or a construction partner or whatever, is really important in identifying opportunity. There is way more land available in this country than any of us acknowledge or recognize. It's land that you may or may not be able to develop into permanent housing someday, but don't let that stop you from considering it for another solution. There are vacant buildings all over this country right now. They look like warehouses, they look like retail and shopping malls, they look like all kinds of things that have gone out of business during COVID. So think creatively, reach out to your community and ask if the businesses have vacant parking lots, if they have vacant warehouse space that you can use. We can help you leverage, and there are other groups as well that can help you leverage any and all of those spaces to turn them into effective interim shelter solutions. And as long as the residents and the people, the service recipients that are coming in acknowledge and recognize that this is a short-term temporary solution, this is not a substitute for your permanent housing goal. This is something that we're going to utilize short-term to stabilize and get people inside. That can sometimes help with the NIMBYism. It certainly doesn't take it away, but it helps communities to understand we're temporarily cleaning up our streets and addressing this humanitarian crisis that we have. And also, this solution isn't here forever, right? And I can tell you, we have multiple sites across the country that have been protested, actively protested. Neighborhoods didn't want them, all the NIMBYism all the time, and none of them have been taken down. Mind you, once they got set up and they were running and they were well run by very amazing service providers, the community said, wow, this is way better than what we had before, than the alternative. And I actually prefer this because now there's Urban Alchemy or some service provider on site. They're cleaning up my neighborhood. They're keeping the residents inside safe. That makes me feel safe. So the reality is, yes, you're going to get pushback on certain land options. That political will of pushing through that and showing them what the alternative can be, I promise will be a better outcome than not doing anything. And if there's something we can do to assist with entitlement, land selection entitlement, land use permitting is actually a really easy barrier to get around, but it's overwhelming if you don't know how to do it. Don't let that stop you. We can help you with that too. So there's lots of steps to getting something like this set up. We have a whole framework that we can walk people through, whether it be a safe sleep site, pallet site, whatever. We can help people navigate, cities navigate these challenges so that they can get these set up quick and then take it down when they're not needed anymore is the goal, right?
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I'm going to take us in a little bit of a different direction, kind of back to the theme of the webinar we presented on earlier. We've got somebody in the audience asking if we can go a little bit deeper on what are some of those barriers that people who are living on the streets face to receiving or accepting help. Dr. Miller, I might ask you to start with this one because I know your team operates in a number of cities working one-on-one with folks that are living in these situations. So how do we ensure that homeless individuals are aware of these possible resources, and what are some of those barriers to them accepting those resources?
So one thing, I believe the reason why we've been so successful is because all of our work and the way we do it is grounded in the experience of who we serve and really who we are. That really helps a lot. Because again, it's just being conscious of other people's minds, right? What would you want? What would be your barriers, right? One, you got to feel safe that whoever's operating the place that you're going isn't going to hurt you. You know, because now you're kind of stuck in their, universe. You have to be sure that whoever is running it is not going to allow other people to hurt you. You have to, when this is all you have, right, this stuff that's with you, you may have worked really hard to accumulate that, and that's all you have. So it's important to be able to bring that with you, right? As you said, animals, community, how a place looks, how inviting it is. I mean, is it close to the people I know, the things that I know, my family, just basic human concerns. And I think how do you get there is by talking. Sorry, my dog is at it again. By by creating relationships, right? So when you go out and you do outreach, you talk to people. One of the things that I have been really giving me joy is that some of the feedback is our outreach teams, they say, even when some people don't want to accept services at that point, they say, I'm happy you just checked on me. So it's really developing an authentic relationship, not just kind of going in somebody's tent and say, hey, you want some water, and kind of backing up, or, but really making an effort to talk to people and connect, because that first connection is what's going to make a person trust for them to go to this next step. So I think at every step, we have to realize that either what caused people to live on the street or what happened to them while they were on the street, they have a tremendous amount of trauma and concerns around basic survival. And so you have to be totally focused in on that at every step of the process. But it's so doable, right? What I'm telling you is basic stuff, and it's worked, So you just work those strategies, and but you got to make sure every step along the way is secure. So not only is the outreach person a safe person, an honest person, a person that follows through, but the pallet shelter community that you're bringing them into is safe. It's beautiful. It says to people that this is a place of healing and recovery, and you can breathe. Not earth-shattering stuff, basic. It's easy to think about. It's a little more difficult to do, but it's totally doable.
Yeah, I'd love to piggyback off that and add that I can't stress enough the importance of lived experience in breaking down those barriers. Like, this is something that is kind of a hot topic that everybody's talking about right now. And Dr. Miller's team has done it and proven it. And we have a sister nonprofit in Seattle that's done it and proven it. And I've seen it over and over and over again. And Pallet, more than 80% of Pallet staff that build the shelters are folks with lived experience in homelessness, addiction recovery, and exiting the justice system. The model, the products, all of that was built with and informed by lived experience. I see a lot of cities doing the token, which is a good start. So I don't want to discount and minimize what you're doing. They're doing the token like lived experience council, where they bring in folks with lived experience and they ask them questions and they seek to learn from them. That's great. The next step is hire, train, and employ people with lived experience, give them authority to make decisions, to build programs, to run those programs, and to help people exit the streets. If I'm someone who is currently experiencing homelessness and you want me to come inside, I'm much more likely to accept that assistance from someone who says, I've walked in your shoes, I've been in that spot, I've laid on that sidewalk, as opposed to someone from a system that I inherently distrust asking me to come inside. I'm going to say no to that because I don't want what you're offering, because in my mind, maybe you're the one who led me here, whether that's true or not. So we see this everywhere across the country. We have tons of amazing service providers and we love them all. Urban Alchemy is incredibly successful at inviting people inside, getting engagement, and getting that successful exit because of that lived experience. And I'll quickly say too, we have 1 in 3 Americans have a history of justice involvement. I don't know if most people don't know that's a staggering statistic. 1 in 3 Americans have a history of justice involvement. Those folks struggle to get jobs. They struggle to get rental arrangements. A lot of them end up homeless. They are incredibly caring, incredibly creative. They have a ton to offer the world. And if we can train them to be the social service workers that we need to help solve this crisis, not only are we giving them living wage jobs, which might cost $70,000 per tent, but you're employing someone instead of them accessing services. They're now a productive, contributing member of society and getting a living wage. So there's really a beautiful model here of pulling people in, rehabilitating them, and then training and empowering them to be the next generation of workers to solve this crisis.
And I'll just add, as a city, that sometimes there are barriers to cities hiring a lot of folks with lived experience because of background checks and things that are required for us and our wall-to-wall civil service and the different things that we have to deal with. But we have the ability to contract with nonprofits who focus on hiring and working with folks with that lived experience. The nonprofit that I used to work at, their outreach team often has lived experience there. They get it. And so I think it is something that it's absolutely works. It's the nonprofits that we coordinate with that are most successful in getting people into services are the ones that use the model that Amy and Dr. Miller were just talking about of that lived experience.
Yeah, super important. We're coming up on the top of the hour, and I'd love to give each panelist a chance to share any other final thoughts they have on this topic. Before I turn it over, though, I know we've got some questions still in the chat. If you want to head over to our website, or if anybody in the audience has a question that they didn't type in yet, at palletshelter.com, feel free to contact us. As Amy mentioned, our team is super supportive, and we stand ready to help either with our knowledge, or we like to act as pollinators of good ideas because we work in so many amazing cities. So if we didn't get to your question today, feel free to go to palletshelter.com to learn more about what we're doing, or to contact a member of our team. And with that, I'll turn it over to the panel. If there's any final parting words you'd like to offer to the great group of people we've got listening in today.
I'll just start real quick. Again, I think separating the affordable housing crisis from the homelessness and kind of the street level issues that we're dealing with, they are not the same. The community gets them all mushed together, and that doesn't actually help us in our cause. So really, talking about them strategically as separate issues that somehow they do relate, but they're separate issues. And so when you're talking about homelessness and the street level social issues and what we're dealing with there, finding solutions for non-congregate shelter are super important. The main thing is land, education, and balance, that balanced approach that I talked about before. So you've got to find the land and break through that, and that is achievable. Cities do have a lot of land, and Amy referenced all kinds of creative solutions. The education, we did a ton of outreach before we put up the first pallet shelter, helping people understand this is not a teeny village. This is not what you think it is. This is something very different. This is actually going to move people that are living outside causing problems for you inside, and also educating the community. This is different than the other shelters you've experienced. You will not have the barriers to services. So that education, and then the balance that you're constantly kind of making everybody mad. You're enforcing, you're holding people accountable, and you're offering shelter and services and support to people who desperately need them. So thank you for letting me be a part of this panel. I'm very excited to talk on this topic.
Yeah, thank you. We're grateful to have you, Mayor Franklin.
Yeah, and I'll add, it looks like Dr. Miller dropped off, darn those Wi-Fi issues, but I'll just end by saying thank you, Mayor Franklin, so much for joining us and for your insight. I know this is a very complex issue for city officials. It's not as easy as we might make it sound, because we have the privilege of being a corporate partner, and our rules and requirements are much different. And so I want to acknowledge that and just put it out there, and note that we are here to help. Pallet exists because we believe that we can create a world where no one goes unsheltered, and our mission is to end unsheltered homelessness. That doesn't just mean building pallet villages. We're here to help. We want to come alongside city officials and help them be successful. That can look like a lot of things, and we're actually launching a brand new line that we call City Advisory Services, where we will come in and assist you in every way, shape, and form you need to be successful in addressing homelessness, sharing ideas we've seen across the country, helping with land selection, helping with looking at all kinds of opportunities to address homelessness in a variety of ways. And we don't need any sort of recognition for that. We're here to help you. We want to arm you and empower you and help you to be successful in addressing this problem. So if we can be helpful, even if you're not sure if a pallet village is right for your community, fine, please don't be afraid to call us. We still want to help you, and we can help you think about different ways and ideas to do this. And then the final thing I would say is, I think, again, in case you couldn't tell from my previous gushing, the service provision is so important. And we talk to cities all the time who say we don't have service providers, or we have service providers that aren't willing to manage alternative, innovative models because they're so ingrained in how they've done things with congregate sheltering. Totally fine and understandable. We also can help with that. We can introduce you to service providers that might be willing and able to set up shop in your community. We can help you train and educate your existing service provider community to navigate and manage alternative models. There are lots of things we can do to be helpful in that space as well. And we know some amazing service providers. You met one of them today. We know lots of them that we're happy to introduce you to help think about how that service provision can actively move people off the streets sustainably and permanently so that they don't return.
Thanks, Amy. And Dr. Miller, sorry we had some Wi-Fi issues with you, but good to see you again. As we wrap up, are there any final parting thoughts that you and the Urban Alchemy team would like to share with the audience we've got here today?
Well, I think in our experience, we've really had the privilege to witness the miracle of the possibility of change, right? Of lifting the bottom of the bell curve up. And I think that's what we're talking about. I think when we get in these spaces, we all hear a lot of criticism about different aspects. Temporary housing, permanent housing, the costs, all those kinds of things. But what we see in the outcomes is that people have better outcomes, right? In moving into permanent housing and achieving goals towards more stability and an improved quality of life. This problem is getting worse. It's not getting better. And so I think that this is just the beginning. This is the spark of a creative revolution. This is not the end, or this is just the beginning. And the pallet shelter model, I think, that's big, and we can do all kind of creative things and build on top of it. And I really think that's where we are. We're in the middle of a creative evolution. This is not the end of it. And I think a lot of times the press and complainers and critics, they get into this whole thing about, is this better than permanent housing, or is this, and it's like, we have to do something now so that the end of the bell curve isn't so deep. We have to lift it up. And this is just the beginning. And then we build on that, and we have to invest in our people and our cities, so, and we can do it.
Yeah, those great final words. And you're so right. In a space that is often very negative, and for good reason, the challenge of the crisis on our streets is a crisis, and it is a negative situation. But what I really appreciate about all of our panelists today is that they are all forward thinking, they are solutions focused, and they've got their eyes and their energy on progress. I think that's why we're all here today. So I thank all of our panelists again for spending the last hour with us and for sharing your great expertise and knowledge. And I thank all of our participants in the webinar for being here to learn more about this. And again, we stand ready to help if any additional questions arise as you think about what you heard today. With that, I'll give a final thanks to our panelists, and we'll share this recording with all the folks that attended today so you can reference it or share with others after the webinar. Thank you, everybody.